By the summer of 1778, the American Revolution had survived its first great winter of endurance. Washington's army had marched out of Valley Forge. Baron von Steuben had drilled men who once learned mostly by necessity. France had joined the war. The British had abandoned Philadelphia. At Monmouth, the Continental Army had stood in open battle and proved it could face British regulars without dissolving. But survival was not the same as victory. The war did not become simpler after France entered. It became larger. Britain now had to defend an empire. The Caribbean mattered, the Atlantic mattered, Europe mattered, India mattered. British ministers could no longer think only about crushing rebels in North America. They had to think about French fleets, sugar islands, shipping lanes, and the possibility that old enemies would gather around a weakened empire. For the United States, the French alliance was a miracle of opportunity, but also a new kind of challenge. Allies bring strength, but they also bring their own interests, commanders, customs, timing, pride, and misunderstandings. American leaders had spent years pleading for foreign support. Now they had to learn how to fight beside it. On paper, the next target made sense: Newport, Rhode Island. British forces had occupied Newport since 1776. The harbor gave them a valuable base on the New England coast. If Americans and French forces could retake it, the alliance would have an early victory. New England morale would surge, and British power in the region would shrink. The plan brought together Major General John Sullivan, American militia, Continental troops, the young Marquis de Lafayette, and a French fleet under Admiral Charles-Henri Hector, Comte d'Estaing. Expectations were high. After years of isolation, Americans could finally look offshore and see Allied sails. Yet 1778 would teach a hard lesson. The presence of French ships did not automatically solve American problems. Weather still mattered, communication still mattered, pride still mattered. British sea power still mattered. And beyond Newport, the war was spreading into places where the revolution looked very different from congressional declarations and parade ground drill. In the frontier valleys of Pennsylvania and New York, families lived under threat from Loyalist and native raids. In the Illinois country, George Rogers Clark prepared to carry Virginia's claims into British-held western posts. At sea, American privateers and naval captains struck British commerce and even touched British waters. In the South, British commanders looked at Georgia and the Carolinas and wondered whether Loyalists might rise if a royal army appeared. The Revolution had not become one war. It had become many. Episode 5 begins there, not with a single battlefield, but with a map expanding in every direction. Newport was a prize, but it was also a trap of geography, tide, and timing. Rhode Island's Narragansett Bay offered harbors, islands, channels, and approaches that demanded coordination. British troops held Newport on a Quidneck Island. American forces under John Sullivan gathered to strike by land. French warships under d'Estaing arrived with the power Americans had long imagined. Ships of the line, guns, sailors, marines, and the prestige of a major European navy. For many New Englanders, the sight of French sails was astonishing. Only a generation earlier, Britain and France had fought each other across North America. Colonists had grown up hearing France described as an enemy. Now French officers were allies in the cause of American independence. History had turned quickly, and not everyone knew how to feel about it. Lafayette understood the emotional and political importance of the moment. He was both French and deeply attached to Washington's army. He wanted the alliance to work not only as strategy, but as trust. At Newport, he tried to serve as a bridge between American expectations and French military reality. Sullivan's army grew as militia arrived. Men came from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and beyond. Some expected a decisive stroke. Others came because militia duty demanded it, because neighbors were watching, or because British occupation had shaped life in the region for too long. The plan required the French fleet to block British escape and support the American move against Newport. D'Estaing brought real strength, but he also had responsibilities beyond American impatience. French ships could not be risked carelessly. A fleet was not merely a symbol. It was an expensive, strategic instrument, and France had entered a global war. Then the British fleet appeared. Admiral Richard Howe moved to challenge d'Estaing. The two fleets maneuvered, and the possibility of a major naval battle opened off the coast. For American troops waiting on land, the sea became the center of the campaign. Their hopes rose and fell with ships they could not command. Then came the storm. A violent storm scattered and damaged both fleets. Masts cracked, rigging tore, ships limped away for repairs. D'Estaing decided he had to take the French fleet to Boston to refit rather than remain at Newport. To the French, this was a naval necessity. To many Americans, it felt like abandonment. The first major test of the alliance had become a test not of shared victory, but of wounded expectations. When D'Estaing sailed for Boston, Sullivan's army was left exposed and angry. American militia had gathered for a combined operation. They had expected French naval power to help trap the British at Newport. Without the fleet, the balance changed. British reinforcements might arrive. American supplies were uncertain, militia enlistments were short. The mood shifted from confidence to frustration. Sullivan criticized the French decision in language that caused offense. French officers resented what they saw as unfair blame. Lafayette worked desperately to calm both sides. He rode hard between commanders, trying to preserve the alliance from a crisis born not of betrayal, but of different military realities. This was the awkward truth of coalition warfare. Americans wanted immediate help in a local campaign. French commanders had to protect a fleet that mattered across the Atlantic world. Both sides could be right about their own needs and still misunderstand one another. Meanwhile, British forces under Sir Robert Pigot remained in Newport. As American numbers shrank and British confidence grew, Sullivan chose to withdraw from positions near the city. On August 29, 1778, British troops attacked the retreating Americans in what became the Battle of Rhode Island. The battle was hard fought. American forces, including units with black and native soldiers, helped hold the line during the withdrawal. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, often remembered for the service of black soldiers within it, became part of the story of the battle's disciplined defense. The Americans did not retake Newport, but they avoided destruction. The campaign ended without the great Allied victory many had imagined. Yet failure did not break the alliance. That mattered. Washington, Congress, Lafayette, and French officials all had to manage anger carefully. The alliance was too important to lose because one campaign had gone wrong. Newport showed how difficult cooperation would be. It also showed that both sides had reasons to keep trying. For viewers of the war from London, Paris, and Philadelphia, the lesson was clear. France's entry changed everything, but it did not guarantee American success. The British still held New York. They still held Newport. Their navy still mattered. Their commanders could adapt. The revolution was now more powerful, but also more complicated. While commanders argued over fleets and failed sieges on the coast, another kind of war intensified inland. There, no grand alliance ceremony softened the violence. There were farms, forts, families, loyalist neighbors, patriot militias, native nations defending homelands, and raids that left communities traumatized for generations. The Revolutionary War on the frontier did not look like formal lines at Monmouth. It looked like smoke over a valley. It looked like families fleeing to stockades. It looked like old neighbors choosing different sides. It looked like native communities trying to survive a conflict that threatened their lands, no matter which empire or republic claimed victory. In 1778, the Frontier War became especially bitter in Pennsylvania and New York. British officers, Loyalist Rangers, and native allies saw frontier raids as a way to weaken the rebellion, punish settlements, disrupt supplies, and draw Patriot forces away from main theaters. Many native leaders, especially among the Haudenosaunee who allied with Britain, saw the American Revolution through the lens of land. American expansion threatened their future. British alliance seemed to many the best available defense. The result was not simple good against evil. It was a brutal civil and border war where every side carried grief and fear. In July, the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania became the scene of disaster. A force of Loyalists and native allies attacked local Patriot defenders. Fighting near Fort ended in defeat for the settlers' militia. Afterward, stories of massacre spread through Patriot newspapers, some true in essence, some exaggerated in detail for political effect. The name Wyoming became a rallying cry of frontier suffering. For families in the region, propaganda was less important than loss. Men did not come home. Homes were abandoned or burned. Survivors carried memories of terror into a war that already felt personal. In November, Cherry Valley in New York suffered its own attack. Loyalist forces and native warriors struck a settlement where civilians and defenders were caught in chaos. Deaths of women and children shocked patriot communities. The raid deepened calls for retaliation. Joseph Brant, Walter Butler, and other frontier figures became names loaded with fear and hatred in patriot memory. But again, the reality was layered. Loyalists believed they were fighting rebels who had torn apart the empire. Native warriors fought in a world where neutrality was often impossible and American settlement threatened survival. Patriots saw raids on civilians as proof that Britain had unleashed savage war. The frontier burned because the revolution had become a struggle over land, allegiance, and the future of whole peoples. Washington could not ignore it. Neither could Congress. The raids helped set the stage for major American retaliation in 1779, especially the Sullivan-Clinton expedition against Haudenosaunee towns. That campaign would devastate native communities and deepen the war's consequences far beyond independence politics. For Episode 5, The Frontier matters because it shows the revolution's darker expansion. France and America celebrated alliance. Diplomats spoke of liberty. Armies drilled and marched. But in the valleys and forests, the war became intimate, retaliatory, and hard to contain. And farther west, another American commander was preparing a very different kind of campaign. George Rogers Clark was young, bold, and willing to gamble with distance. The western country was vast compared with the coastal theaters. British posts at places like Detroit, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes helped shape alliances and influence frontier war. Virginia claimed enormous western lands, and Clark believed that if British authority in the Illinois country could be broken, American claims beyond the Appalachians would be strengthened. In 1778, Clark led a small force down the Ohio River toward the Illinois country. This was not a grand army with endless supplies. It was an expedition built on surprise, endurance, and the willingness to operate far from easy support. In July, Clark captured Kaskaskia without the kind of bloody assault viewers might expect. Surprise, local diplomacy, and the complex loyalties of French-speaking inhabitants mattered as much as muskets. Many residents of the Illinois country were French Catholics who had lived under shifting imperial flags. The revolution arrived to them not as a familiar town meeting debate, but as another turn in a long history of empire. Clark understood that victory required persuasion. He worked to win over local French communities. Father Pierre Gibault later helped encourage support for the American side in the region. Cahokia also came under American control. Vincennes would become the next dramatic target, changing hands and setting up Clark's winter march in 1779. The Western campaign mattered because it expanded American imagination. The revolution was not only about Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. It was also about who would control the interior of North America. But that interior was not empty. Native nations lived there, governed there, hunted there, traded there, and fought to preserve their own futures. American claims to Western land carried consequences. Victory against Britain could become expansion against native homelands. Clark's campaign, therefore, has two meanings. In American memory, it is daring and strategic, a small force winning influence across a huge region. In native history, it is part of the pressure that would accelerate American movement into Western lands. Both truths belong in the story. By the end of 1778, Clark had changed the Western map, but the situation remained unstable. British power at Detroit endured. Henry Hamilton, the British lieutenant governor there, would retake Vincennes before Clark's famous winter counterstroke. The West was not settled, it was opening. At the same time, another battlefield stretched across the ocean itself. The United States did not have a navy that could match Britain ship for ship. The Royal Navy was one of the central instruments of British power. It protected trade, transported armies, blockaded ports, and connected the empire. But weaker powers can still hurt stronger powers at sea. American privateers became a constant irritation and danger to British commerce. Privateering was legalized raiding, carried out by privately owned vessels authorized to capture enemy ships. It blurred the line between patriotism, profit, and naval war. For Britain, every captured merchantman meant insurance costs, angry merchants, and pressure on the government. For American ports, privateering brought money, prisoners, supplies, and a sense that the empire could be touched. John Paul Jones gave that sea war a name and a face. In 1778, commanding the Ranger, Jones carried the war into British waters. He raided Whitehaven, a port he knew from earlier life, and attempted to strike fear along the coast. The raid caused limited physical damage, but enormous psychological shock. The rebellion was no longer only something Britain fought across the Atlantic. It could appear at home. Jones then fought and captured HMS Drake off Carrickfergus. The victory was small compared with fleet battles, but symbolically powerful. An American warship had taken a British vessel near British waters. Newspapers noticed, sailors noticed, merchants noticed. Jones was ambitious, difficult, brave, and hungry for recognition. He understood the value of audacity. Like many figures in the Revolution, he was not simple. He could inspire and irritate in equal measure. But he helped give the American naval war a dramatic identity. The war at sea also belonged to less famous captains and crews. Privateers from New England, the mid-Atlantic, and other ports chased prizes across dangerous waters. Sailors faced storms, capture, prison ships, and death. British prison hulks became notorious in American memory, especially around New York. France's entry made the naval war more serious. French fleets could challenge British control in ways American ships could not. British commanders now had to think about convoys, bases, islands, and enemy squadrons. The American Revolution had become part of a global maritime struggle. That mattered for the next British decision. If the war in the north had become expensive and inconclusive, if France threatened the wider empire, perhaps Britain needed a new approach in America. The answer they chose was the South. By late 1778, British leaders were searching for a way to regain initiative. The Northern War had not destroyed Washington. New England remained rebellious. Philadelphia had been taken and abandoned. Saratoga had brought France in. Holding New York remained useful, but it did not end the rebellion. The South offered a tempting alternative. British officials believed there were many loyalists in Georgia and the Carolinas. If a British army appeared, perhaps loyal subjects would rally. The region also offered valuable ports, rice, indigo, trade routes, and connections to the Caribbean. With France now threatening British possessions elsewhere, southern bases could support imperial strategy. Georgia became the first target. Savannah, the capital and key port, was vulnerable. American defenses in Georgia were weaker than those around Washington's main army. The state's politics were divided. Loyalist support existed, though British hopes often exaggerated how easily it could be mobilized. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell sailed from New York with a British expedition. In December 1778, his force approached Savannah. American defenders under General Robert Howe faced a difficult situation. Limited troops, imperfect intelligence, and terrain the British could exploit. The attack came quickly. British forces used a route through swampy ground, guided in ways that helped them outflank American positions. On December 29, 1778, Savannah fell. The British victory was decisive. American forces were routed. The city became the first major southern prize of Britain's new strategy. For patriots, Savannah's fall was a warning. The war was moving. The South would not remain a secondary theatre. For loyalists, the British arrival offered hope and danger. Hope that royal authority might return, danger because civil war would intensify wherever neighbors divided. For enslaved people, the Southern War would become especially complex. British proclamations and military movements offered some chances to seek freedom by reaching British lines, though British policy was inconsistent and often self-interested. Patriot slaveholders spoke of liberty while defending slavery. The Southern campaign would expose that contradiction with brutal clarity. Savannah did not end the war, but it opened a door. Behind that door lay Charleston, Camden, Kings Mountain, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and Yorktown. The fall of Savannah changed the rhythm of the Revolution. Until then, many viewers of the war could still imagine the main story as Washington against British commanders in the north, with dramatic side chapters elsewhere. Savannah made that picture obsolete. The South would become central. British troops entered the city. Loyalists emerged more confidently. Patriot officials fled or regrouped. Civilians calculated what survival required. Some welcomed the crown. Some feared retaliation. Some tried to appear neutral. Some had no freedom to choose because slavery, poverty, gender, or dependence placed decisions in other hands. The British restored royal government in Georgia and looked outward. If Georgia could be secured, perhaps South Carolina would follow. If Charleston fell, perhaps the Carolinas could be rolled up. If Loyalist militia could be organized, perhaps British regulars would not have to carry the whole burden. That was the dream of the Southern strategy. But the South was not a sleeping Loyalist kingdom waiting to be awakened. It was divided, violent, and politically complex. British victories could produce resistance as well as obedience. Patriot militias could disappear, then reappear. Loyalist and Patriot neighbors could turn the countryside into a war of revenge. Enslaved people could use the chaos to seek freedom, forcing both sides to confront the reality beneath revolutionary language. Savannah also gave France and America another test. In 1779, a combined French and American attempt to retake the city would fail at terrible cost. That future defeat was not yet visible at the moment of capture, but the pattern was already present. Alliance brought opportunity, but coordination remained hard. By the end of 1778, the revolution had become a war of many fronts. In Rhode Island, the first Allied operation had failed, but the alliance survived. On the frontier, settlements burned and retaliation gathered. In the West, George Rogers Clark had opened an American claim to the Illinois country. At sea, privateers and John Paul Jones carried the war onto British commerce and British nerves. In Georgia, Savannah fell, and the South became the next great theater. The year had not given the Americans a clean triumph like Saratoga. Instead, it gave them something harder to manage: scale. The revolution was now too large for one army, one city, one coastline, or one commander to define. The story of 1778 after Monmouth is easy to overlook because it does not give us one neat victory. There is no single surrender like Saratoga, no winter symbol as famous as Valley Forge, no declaration like 1776. Instead, 1778 gives us expansion, outward, westward, southward, seaward, and into the tangled politics of alliance. That expansion mattered. Newport showed that the French alliance would require patience, diplomacy, and humility. Americans had to learn that an ally was not a servant. France had to learn that American politics and expectations could be volatile. Lafayette's role as a bridge became more important than ever. The frontier showed that the revolution could be morally brutal. Liberty language did not prevent burned settlements, retaliatory campaigns, or pressure on native homelands. The war for independence was also a war over land and power. Clark's Western campaign showed American ambition reaching beyond the Appalachians. It helped shape later claims to the interior, but it also foreshadowed the conflicts that would follow independence. The Sea War showed that Britain could be hurt indirectly. Privateers, raiders, and French fleets could stretch British attention across oceans. Savannah showed where the war was going next. The British would bet heavily on the South. They would find victories there, some of them devastating. But they would also find a countryside that could swallow armies, fracture loyalties, and turn tactical success into strategic exhaustion. For Washington, watching from the main army, the war had become more difficult to control. For Congress, it became harder to finance and coordinate. For Britain, it became harder to win cheaply. For ordinary people, it became harder to escape. That is why Episode 5 matters. It is the hinge between the Revolution as a northern rebellion and the Revolution as a continent-wide and global war. The next chapter will move deeper into 1779, when frontier retaliation, southern pressure, naval daring, and global conflict intensify. The revolution has survived. Now it is spreading.